Welcome back in our Issues crew to part 2 of our epic conversation with Michael Coppage. Let's get deeper. Without further ado, here is the IOI crew.
Well, I will say, I do think that everyone is dealing with some sort of mental health issues because, just navigating through the world, sitting in traffic can be challenging to your level of frustration. I just think that, some people live more on the extremes than others, and I've been fortunate to not, have been in those extreme spaces. So I've been able to use that privilege and that experience to help other people, and I've been in this, I've worked in the mental health space specifically for 19 years. You know what I mean? I mean, that's longer than I've lived in Cincinnati, and I've been in Cincinnati since 2007. And I've worked with young people. I've worked with adults. I've worked with like forensic folks. I've worked, in all kinds of settings, doing all kinds of things, all with the goal of helping folks get some relief or learn some competency that I think can help them. And I never see the fruits of my labor, but it's so funny because not this week, but the week prior and the week before that, I ran into 2 separate people who I worked with, as a provider. And both of those people ran up to me to hug me because they were actually happy to see me. Like I could tell that whatever I did was something that they appreciated,
Dude, that's the best. Like,
well, I never, you don't really get those experiences.
I know
on the provider side. So for me, I'm 2 for 2. So I'm like, okay, maybe I was good at it, and maybe I really was able to to offer people things that they thought were helpful, not necessarily what I thought was best for them. Yeah. Because sometimes, what I think is best for people aren't ready to receive. So,
Right. I've come to experience that too. I've been, I'm certain I know what's best for you. Let me help you out. And it was just, the person was not ready to hear it and it made everything worse. Yep. And so that's a big component, is knowing what, even if you think it's what's best, knowing whether or not that will help.
Yeah. And so I've just, I think my superpower is hearing what people say, regardless of what words they use, and so I can hear what someone is saying, and I can figure out, I typically figure out a way to punch through,
I love that. We talk about that all the time.
Yeah, we do.
Because, we all have this catalog of nouns and verbs, and we throw in adverbs and adjectives. But what they mean to me is not necessarily what you hear me saying.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of the time. Right. And so I think I asked you earlier when we started talking, what I heard you say, Michael, was.
Yeah. So reflective listening is a great tool because, when you summarize what someone has said in your own words and they affirm that, yes, that's what I mean, then you can build off of that. You can continue. Right. Because if that's not, then you have to just kind of stop and let me figure out what it is you're saying before we move on. Because if not, whatever this could have been is going to lose some of its momentum, some of its character. And I don't think we're going to see or yield the results that we might want,
Me too.
Let me ask you this, Michael. What led you into the provider field?
Thank you. 19 years. That's where I was going.
Yeah.
And you know me from the board of the Recovery Center.
Really quickly, that's how I know Michael is. Michael was on the board of the Recovery Center when I
Shout out to the Recovery Center of Hamilton County.
Shout out to the Recovery Center. But I, I've won, some awards from the Ohio Psychiatric Physicians Foundation.
That's amazing.
And I got into this field because I needed a job. Wow. I went to Philadelphia for graduate school, and when I got there, my girlfriend at the time was at Temple University, and she was working on her master's degree. She's now a doctor with her own private practice and stuff, but she was into clinical psychology, specifically with children. Gotcha. And so she knew all of these openings and stuff that she just kind of connected me to. And I started working in a detention center for juvenile delinquents, right? And I was there for 3 years, and I realized, how much I cared. And so when I moved to Ohio, I applied for jobs in a similar field.
Yeah.
And I also applied for a job at the Art Academy, and both spaces offered me a position, but I work for Talbot House now, but it wasn't Talbot House at the time. It was another organization that Talbot House absorbed. But I chose that job because it was closer to where I lived, because I didn't know, I'd never owned a car in my life. I had to buy a car to move here. Then when I get here, I moved to Oxford, which is where my ex went to school in Miami. And so I had this car. I'm commuting 27 miles one way to go to work, and I'm driving around all day as a case manager.
Yeah.
And so I just chose the job that was the closest to where I lived. And so I've been in the field ever since, I'm like,
because imagine you chose the other job, it would have changed the whole trajectory of your life.
It would have. I don't know if it would have been for the better though.
Right.
Because I learned some skills in this mental health field that are the backbone of my practice, my artistic practice.
Yeah.
And
can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah. What are those skills?
Yeah. No. So reflective listening, being an active listener, right? That's one, I spend a lot of time with everyday hamburger and hot dog people, and I listen to conversations, and sometimes those conversations make me cringe because they're just as straightforward as possible. And I use, this kind of dialectical behavioral approach to address some of these things, right? So I'm using a lot of prompting. I'm using a lot of distraction. I'm having people focus. I'm using a lot of the tenets of the model to engage with people, like that, placing these murals out in public, right? With shirts that say lesbian or whatever. It's a prompt. It compels you to give a response, and there's no one around for you to respond to. So that promotes this internal dialogue. And so I'm using the cognitive and dialectical behavioral models to really penetrate, people's defenses, so that, if they can't have an honest conversation with me, they can have at least have an honest conversation with themselves.
That's big.
And so it's just, I chose that gig not knowing that it would lead here. I chose it because I was new here. I needed to make some money, and I don't regret it, and I still work there. I'm a full-time artist, but I still have a job, and recently I've been able to create a position for myself where I work as an artist for the organization.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
But with, a mental health population, with a substance abuse population. I go out in the community on a resource bus and try to bring people into services. So there's a community, it's always been a community engagement aspect of my practice, but now I get to do that as my job. That's awesome. Instead of, I was a supervisor, I had 4 sites in 2 counties. I had 40 people under me. It was ridiculous, so it was getting in the way of where my true passions lie. And, and I was brave enough to go and ask the agency if we could do something different. And they were like, sure.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So
that self-advocacy is so important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, you said earlier you didn't think what you were doing was courageous, but you just said I was brave enough to do it.
I was brave enough to do what? What was I brave enough to do?
To ask. Say, hey, to Talbot.
Yeah, because that's not courageous though. That's just brave enough to ask, because I could have easily talked myself out of that. I mean, like my exact question was, I need to figure out how to quit this job and keep my insurance.
And that's the question Americans
self-preservation. Like, yeah.
And she looked at me and she was like, I could tell that nobody had ever asked this question before. And I maybe brave is the word. Maybe I just had to have the like audacity, because that's what I needed. I needed that. And what I was given was an opportunity to create a role for myself, which I didn't go in asking for that, but that was actually what I really needed and what I really wanted, and it's a much better fit. Like, I like what I'm doing now so much better than what I was doing before. I lost a little money on the exchange, but I lost a lot of responsibility. On the exchange. So for me, it's a win.
I got you, and I think oh crap, I forgot what I was going to say. Bill raised his mic. What were you going to say?
Michael, whenever I have a chance to talk to an artist, I always ask him, how do you know when you're done? How do you know when you're finished with a piece?
Great question.
With some pieces it's easier than others. I think with works like paintings or paintings, I guess, is the only one I really feel this way with, right? I don't question if I'm done with anything else other than paintings and textiles, right?
Okay.
Those two, right? Because you can always do more. I think the trick is knowing when to stop.
Yeah,
so that it's not overworked. But with the bronze sculpture, I know I got to make a mold, I got to make a wax, I got to pour the bronze. We got to finish it and patina it, and then we got to stage it. Right. I mean, there's really nothing else to do after that. I mean, it's a pretty finite kind of done.
That makes sense to my brain.
It's a little bit more of a checklist and less of a, here's the creative process. What will happen here? You know what I mean?
Painting, it's like, I could do this texture a little bit more. Maybe this should be impasto, or maybe this should be sgraffito or whatever it is, and maybe I should do some glazes, or maybe you could just get lost in the sauce,
Right.
Absolutely.
And I, to simplify it for myself, I approach painting the same way. So, I don't use glazes. I don't really use mediums. I don't even mix paint. I put paint side by side, color by color, and your brain's gonna do the work for me. If you look at the floor, this floor is brown, we would all agree. But if you look at this floor, it's orange, it's red, it's yellow, it's brown, it's black. There's even like purple in here that you can see. But your brain is so focused on your life-saving functions like breathing and depth perception and balance that it doesn't have time to waste on what color a floor is. So in my paintings, I just put color next to color, and your brain will compress everything for me. I know that to be true. So I don't get caught up in all of the the vastness that a painting can offer a creative.
I'm glad you mentioned the color piece, because the first time you told me that, it was a couple of years ago, I think. We have 3 big portraits hanging at the recovery center that you did.
Yeah.
And I went and looked at them.
Forgot about those.
They're the best part. Every time I give a tour, they're the best part. Everyone's like, "Oh my God, these are amazing."
They are, and that's why they're hung in that corner, because
my brain just put that together. Because I remember you telling me it was Michael's work in there, and I was just like, "Oh yeah, haven't heard of that guy yet." Now I know exactly who you are.
I went and stood in front of those 3 pieces and looked at them, and you're right. The colors don't overlap. They're side by side.
Yeah. And sometimes on top of each other, but they're not mixed. And these aren't the colors that are in our skin, but somehow they make sense. And it's because your eye does all of the work for me. It's not even your eye, it's your brain. Your brain,
that's crazy.
is so focused on more important stuff. It's like, dude, I don't have time for this. I'm trying to keep your heart going and your lungs going. And like, we need, like.
You used this expression 3 times and I loved it. And you said, your brain does the work for me.
Yeah.
My brain is working for you. And you're exactly right.
Yeah.
In those circumstances, that's exactly what's happening. We were talking about the fact that if you close your right eye or your left eye, you can see your nose.
Mm-hmm.
But if you open both of them, your brain a long time ago
forgot what your nose looks like.
I don't need that.
Yep. And I think that in some way, I've always been interested in understanding people, but not necessarily from a gender standpoint or a race standpoint or whatever kind of topical standpoint, but just understanding how people's brains work, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
If I can understand,
I can talk about that all day.
well,
same.
You can get scientific with this. So many ways to approach this, but as an artist, understanding, how someone's brain works with color, how someone's brain works in front of a painting versus a sculpture, understanding, how to use the work to prompt some kind of thing that starts here, and travels, right? Yeah. And so, I think I've always done that. I just think that like I've gotten more and more proficient with it, as my body of work has developed and some of these things have come online.
Yeah. Michael, what kind of responses are you getting from other artists with your work?
And from the community. I would love to know what the community feels as well.
Yeah. I don't really talk to a whole lot of artists, so I don't know what response it is. I know like the curators and like some of the folks in the institutional settings are really intrigued by it, and I think that it's resonating well with them. What I'm trying to do. I did have an artist colleague say to me that he thought I was really brave. He said that. So my last show at the Westin, he said that that this show he thought would set the tone for a lot of artists in the city to be more brave, because this was like an exhibition about like kind of fearlessness. And, I agreed with the fearlessness part, it's my work. It's my, why would I be afraid to talk about my own experiences? There's I don't really feel like there are very many safe spaces for me anyway. So like, fuck it, like let's just do it. This is like an opportunity to really like kind of pop the top off of this. So let's do it, and
I'll make the world my safe space.
And, and I did, and with that example, but
let me address, you want to keep going?
I was going to talk about the community, but I can
let me address that right quick, because I was a member of the community when I went to the Aeronaut to see your exhibition, and I came to the talk back. I think.
The artist talk.
Yeah. And
was that the panel, or was that the one with Kyle Inskeep? The guy from the news.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as a white guy in a room full of not a lot of white people, it was an uncomfortable experience to a degree, but nothing compared to walking into the exhibition on the lower level.
Yeah.
With the picnic.
Yeah.
And a white guy hanging from a tree.
Yeah. Yeah.
For me, that connected a lot of neurons that needed connecting, some synapses.
Yeah.
And blew my mind. And I think I told you when I emailed you about coming on the podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. You shared.
Whenever we have a conversation, I know it's going to make me uncomfortable to some degree, but that's going to make me a better person.
Well, I will say this, that my goal isn't to really make people uncomfortable, right? I think that it's uncomfortable because, like I've taken your likeness and appropriated it you know, and woven into historically traumatic Black experience.
Yeah.
You know? And so that thing that you feel is also the thing that we feel.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We just feel it a lot more. And like, I think that if I can create work that where I'm able to share that thing, because sometimes you try to talk about it and people just don't feel it. They just don't. It regardless of how great of a communicator I think I am, sometimes I can't thread the needle in a way to help people understand it. So when you create a succinct image like that one, like the cookout, right? It does what I'm not able to do just in regular conversation.
Yeah, I think that visceral experience is so important because when you feel things, it's stored in a different part of your brain. Like it's stored in that, you know, that feeling mind rather than just, you know, that logical brain. And I think that's so important because it imprints in you.
Yeah, it's one thing to be able to, it's one thing to listen to somebody's experience of something and, you know, imprint it in your brain and understand that this is something that someone else goes through and this must be crazy and blah, blah, blah. But it's another thing to walk into a room and be surrounded by intentionally created art or sculptures or whatever it is that's putting you in this person's position in a way that any description can't.
Yeah, and I think too, with me being a writer and with me being a poet, and I'm always trying to vocalize my experience via words. That's the whole part of it, right? And I think that there's so much that is sometimes lost because of the interpretation piece. And I think that, you know, with what Bill described about his experience of being uncomfortable and feeling that and being like making those connections, I think is such an important experience for people to really be put in the shoes of someone else.
And that's a great way to kind of like summarize that, you know, like you're put into a bunch of different people's shoes
in our
all
issues.
From the same community though, you know, and you know, and I think that community members, I think their response in many ways was like Bill's, you know. I think that a lot of the Black people who came, they already understand what this is.
Yeah.
You know, they already know what this is. They've made attempts, as I've made attempts to talk about it and to, you know, talk about all our own individual ideas and thoughts about it.
Yeah.
So I think it resonated with them because they felt some representation.
Yeah.
They felt like, you know, I used my platform to speak about a collective, you know, or from a collective stance. I think that a lot of the white people, particularly white men, you know, we got a lot of complaints about that show from mostly white males.
I'm not surprised.
Cisgendered white males. But I think outside of,
I'm sorry, older?
I don't know how old they were.
What were their complaints?
I mean, if they're younger, they can be raised that way.
The work in the lobby. They hadn't even come in to go downstairs. So
of course,
the white box, the police officers who had murdered Black men and them being the wallpaper behind the black box.
Didn't even give it a chance, and they're already judging it.
But you know, they saw like white privilege, and they like kind of lost it.
Triggers.
But it's cool. Like that's cool. That's what they're walking by. They're coming out the steakhouse. They're doing whatever they're doing, and boom, you know.
And they've exposed themselves.
But I think that, you know, most other people had that same sort of thing. You know, I think that it was this I'm reluctant to say this eye-opening thing because I don't know that I would describe my work as that way, but I think it was this conscious raising experience, you know.
I understand, I think what you're saying about not wanting to say it about your own work, but it's very eye-opening to me.
Yeah.
I would
describe that, to see it, it's eye-opening to them as well.
Yeah.
I think too, like, it seems to invoke that sense of curiosity, which, you know, engages that thinking part of your brain to really start asking yourself these questions. And like you were talking about, like prompting earlier, that's what it's causing you to do. Like, wow, look at this thing that I never had thought about before.
And that's where I get wrapped around the axle, because that's my response is, what do I do? What do I do with this information?
Yeah. And I'm glad you asked that. I'm really, really happy you asked that, because, you know, I think that a lot of people think that now I need to do something like some big visual thing that people can see, like picket or protest, you know, like we don't need to do any of those things. Like, you know, like I think that, you know, I really believe this, that like if things are going to change, it's going to be small incremental changes that lead to huge transformative shifts, like in our culture. And I think that happens through language, right? So for example, you know, like eliminating like, oh, like I blacked out, or, oh, I'm in such a black hole right now, or even meteorologists using black ice. By eliminating like this kind of language from our collective use, I think decreases the perpetuation of, you know, the harm associated with black, right? That's something that all it takes is a little forethought before you say it, like, oh, I'm the black sheep of my family, you know? We all use these words. Well, I don't use these words, but we've all grown up using these words, and it's shaped like part of, you know, the identity that we project onto black people. And so I think that we can start in places like that. Like, you know, like I don't say picnic, right? Because of what a picnic became known as and for people from my community. So, you know, I know people who say, you know, what's dining al fresco or whatever, some fancy set out, cook out, grill out, whatever.
Cookout, right? Yeah.
But you know, there's language that we use that it comes up in my work all the time, that, you know, I, you know, am proposing that we excise, or that we investigate a little further, or redefine, like the whole monkey thing, you know, like,
yeah, I thought that was pretty creative.
You know, I'm not just painting white people as monkeys, like for revenge, you know. It's about, you know, these are species native to Asia. In Asia, they refer to people as monkeys. But when they call people monkeys, it's not based on color, it's based on behavior, you know. So a monkey is a disruptor of harmony. Well, historically, I say this a million times, but historically, every indigenous person on the planet's harmony was disrupted by the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, the English,
by colonizers,
the Spanish, right? All different species of the same monkey. But because my work is about contemporary America, you know, that disruption looks like gentrification. It looks like redlining. It looks like redistricting. It looks like a bunch of things. So I'm redefining who a monkey could be, you know, and you know, and creating a more inclusive space for those conversations. You know, we talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we don't think about like, you know, I've taken this kind of path where inclusivity looks like pulling you into the bad stuff, right? Because inclusivity, like on the receiving end of my experience, looks like someone giving me money or an opportunity and then feeling great about it and photographing with me and saying, hey, look what we did, look what we're doing. And they get the award of the year, right? When really, you know, we need to like take a different look at what inclusivity could be, you know, because when I include you into a scene like the cookout, or a scene like, you know, the white box, you know, it creates this like it creates this accountability. It places you in the middle of something that, you might not be okay with, and you might have to do a little, kind of navigating to like metabolize this experience. And hopefully when it's fully metabolized, what's left is empathy or empathic response or understanding for someone who's not part of your group, because you enjoy a comfort that most of us just don't have. Discomfort is a huge part of my lived experience, and almost every space I go into is a room or something that I have to make an adjustment for, right? I have to walk in the room, I have to read the room, I have to understand whether if it's the Chinese store in my neighborhood, if it's the store owned by the Arabs or the Indians, if it's the white workplace that I'm going to. Every one of those, none of those spaces belong to me. So I have to make adjustments to navigate through them. Yeah. And I'm working from a space of discomfort all the time. Like you all need to be included in that space so that you have a quote unquote Black experience, right? You can have a better understanding for what this might be like day in and day out, and having to navigate how you feel about a thing versus, you being able to eat and feed your family and, see a doctor and all the other things that, you need to do to take care of yourself. So, I mean, it's deep, man. And I think that, this is one of those topics that is hard for institutions to stand behind, really. It's easy to stand behind it when it's, beautifully painted and it's over articulated and it's whatever it is. But when it's direct and specific, when it's like, when it comes with SMART goals, right? Right. When it comes with SMART goals, it's hard for institutions to really support it and stand behind it because they don't have the faith that their audiences are ready for it. I'm making it now, and I'm just going to say, hey, I'm ahead of my time, then, because I'm not going to stop making it so that I can cater to your audience. Right. Like I'm going to create this work so that when your audience is ready developmentally, in terms of conversations of race, this work is there for them to help them in their journey,
Join us again in 2 weeks for part 3, where we get deeper into his work, its implications, and how his audience reacted. Don't forget you're awesome. Peace out.